The morning air over Normandy was thick with cordite and the smell of burnt fuel. June 8, 1944. Just 2 days after the Allied landings. The hedgerows outside Saint-Lô had become a maze of mud, smoke, and dying men. The sky hung low, a grey film of drizzle muting the thunder of distant artillery. Among the scattered bodies, a small group of American medics crawled forward, helmets painted with red crosses, their satchels clinking with morphine syrettes and bandages. They moved without rifles, only their armbands marking them as something between soldier and saint. The gunfire did not always respect that distinction. Private First Class Charles Doc Jennings of the 2nd Armoured Division pressed his hand over a German soldier's wound. A deep shrapnel tear through the abdomen. The young man's uniform was soaked dark. Jennings shouted for a stretcher, ignoring the fearful glances of his fellow infantrymen who could barely tell friend from foe amid the chaos. A few yards away, a captured German officer, Hauptmann Klaus Werner, watched in disbelief. His men, scattered and broken, were now being treated by the very Americans they had sworn to kill. The medics worked quickly, cutting through tunics, setting splints, whispering soft English words no one understood, but everyone felt. Nearby, an American jeep ambulance reversed into the hedgerow. 2 medics lifted a stretcher inside. Half the patients wore field grey, the other olive drab. No one spoke. The sound of the engine rose like a heartbeat, fading into the distance toward a field hospital near Carentan. German prisoners looked at one another, stunned. In their world, mercy did not cross battle lines. Yet here, in this muddy patch of France, the rules seemed rewritten, not by generals, but by men with bandages instead of bullets. As the medics moved on, the morning mist thickened. The last thing Werner saw, before being led away, was an American medic kneeling beside another wounded man, this one an enemy sniper. He watched the medic wrap the man's arm with the same care given to his own comrades. That moment would stay with him long after the shooting stopped. The question began to spread through captured ranks. Why would an enemy save us? It was a question that reached far beyond Normandy, into the very heart of how America fought its war. Long before Normandy, the foundation for such mercy had been written into international law. The Geneva Convention of 1929 declared that medical personnel were non-combatants. Their duty was to save lives, regardless of nationality, uniform, or allegiance. For the U.S. Army Medical Corps, this principle was sacred. Their emblem, the Red Cross on a white field, stood as a shield against the madness of war, though that shield was not always respected. In the European theatre, medics were among the most courageous yet vulnerable men on the battlefield. They were trained not to kill, but to crawl into open fire to rescue those who could not crawl out. It was a role that demanded both nerve and grace. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, it brought with it an entire philosophy of medicine in battle. Training centers in places like Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania, produced thousands of medics who learned to treat wounds under combat conditions, tourniquets in the mud, plasma transfusions under fire, triage with seconds to decide who would live or die. By 1944, the U.S. Army had perfected mobile medicine. Forward aid stations, collecting points, and evacuation hospitals designed to move with the front lines. To the Germans, the scale of this system was astonishing. Their medical corps was competent, even skilled, but strained by shortages and the pressure of retreat. What shocked many captured German officers wasn't just American efficiency. It was American humanity. They saw medics tending to enemy wounded as if no war existed, driven by a moral code rooted in something larger than orders. Reports from German POW camps later revealed that many had been confused by this practice. Some thought it a psychological trick. Others saw it as genuine compassion. In interrogation transcripts from 1944, a Wehrmacht captain admitted, "We could not understand why they saved our wounded. We had been told Americans were savages, but they treated our men as their own." This was the unseen battle within the war, the fight to preserve humanity when everything around it was collapsing. The Geneva Convention had set the principle, but it was American medics who proved that such ideals could survive even the brutality of Normandy. What those German officers witnessed in that field would soon lead us deeper into the reality of American battlefield medicine, its chaos, its innovation, and its impossible courage. War rarely gives space for mercy. In Normandy, the front lines were a storm of confusion. Muddy roads jammed with half-tracks, the screams of artillery, and the distant rumble of tanks grinding over hedgerows. Amid that chaos, the U.S. Army Medical Corps had to function with surgical precision. Every second mattered. Every action meant the difference between a man's life or death. When a soldier was hit, the chain of survival began with a cry, "Medic!" Those calls echoed through the smoke and rain as unarmed men ran toward danger. They carried compact pouches filled with sulfur powder, morphine syrettes and bandages, an entire hospital reduced to what could fit on a soldier's back. Their job wasn't glamorous. It was grim, physical, and terrifying. But to every infantryman, those medics were the thin line between agony and hope. The system was brutally efficient. The wounded were first treated in the field, bleeding stopped, shock managed, fractures stabilized. Then came evacuation to an aid station, where doctors triaged the incoming flow under flickering lanterns. The worst cases, abdominal wounds, head injuries, massive blood loss, were rushed to field hospitals set up in barns or church halls. The air inside reeked of disinfectant and diesel, mingled with the metallic scent of blood. Here, American innovation came alive. Portable plasma packs replaced the need for whole blood, saving thousands who would have otherwise died. Sulfur powder prevented infection, and the use of morphine gave wounded men a fighting chance to stay conscious long enough to reach surgery. Combat surgeons performed amputations in minutes, sometimes dozens a day, as nurses worked silently beside them, faces pale under the dim light of generators. Outside, trucks lined up in the mud, waiting to carry men further back to evacuation hospitals near Bayeux or Cherbourg. The cycle never stopped, medics of Thiers. 10 slept only minutes between waves of casualties. They were stretched thin, yet their morale never broke. Many didn't see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as necessary. In that endless rhythm of rescue, one thing became clear. The American medical machine was unlike anything the Germans had faced. It wasn't just about saving their own. It was about refusing to surrender humanity to the war. That refusal would soon reach the enemy directly, in a moment that left even hardened German officers speechless. By late June 1944, the front near Saint-Lô had become a living wound, fields cratered, villages burned to skeletons, and the dead lying unburied under drifting smoke. In that desolation, a strange kind of miracle occurred. The American medics who followed their units into the ruins were not there to take prisoners, but to keep men alive. Any men. And for the Germans, that was a shock deeper than defeat itself. After one fierce engagement outside Pont-Hébert, dozens of wounded German soldiers were left stranded between the lines. Shellfire still thundered, but a small team from the 30th Infantry Division crawled forward under the white flag of the Red Cross. They pulled the Germans out one by one, some missing limbs, others delirious with pain. Witnesses later recalled how the Americans worked methodically, speaking softly, applying morphine, even offering canteens of water. A captured officer, Lieutenant Otto Kruger, could hardly comprehend it. His men had been trained to expect brutality from the Allies. Yet here, in a field littered with helmets and rifles, enemy medics were saving them. He later told an interrogator, "I saw one of your medics carry my radio man on his back through shell bursts. We had left him for dead. You did not." The field hospital at Carentan overflowed that night. American nurses worked beside stretchers marked with both German and American tags. Doctors ignored insignia. The operating lights buzzed and flickered as scalpels moved through blood and gauze, one patient after another. Some of the wounded Germans wept openly, expecting to be finished off once they were patched up. Instead, they were bandaged, stabilized, and tagged for transfer to POW hospitals behind the lines. A US surgeon, Major Harold Green, later wrote in his diary, "War strips away many things, but not the duty of a doctor. We mend what we can. God sorts the rest." That quiet conviction spread through every tent, every stretcher. For the German officers watching from their cots, the realization grew heavy. The enemy they had been taught to fear was fighting a different kind of war, a war that measured victory not only in territory gained, but in lives preserved. And as that truth settled in, they began to wonder how such compassion could exist amid such ruin. American combat medics were among the most extraordinary figures of the Second World War. They carried no weapons, yet walked into the most dangerous places on earth. Their courage wasn't fueled by aggression or glory. It came from duty, an unspoken oath to preserve life in a world bent on destroying it. Every medic knew the risk. The Red Cross painted on a helmet or armband wasn't always respected. German snipers sometimes targeted them deliberately, believing it would cripple American morale. Still, they went forward. Always forward. Training for these men was brutal, but precise. At Camp Barkley, Texas, and Carlisle Barracks in Pennsylvania, recruits learned anatomy, trauma care, and the impossible art of battlefield triage. They practiced under simulated fire, dragging comrades through smoke and explosions, treating casualties in trenches filled with mud and pig's blood. When they shipped out, most were barely 20 years old. Yet once they hit the beaches of Normandy, they became lifelines for entire companies. The mortality rate among combat medics was staggering, second only to frontline infantry. One statistic from the US Army Medical Department revealed that medics were killed or wounded at nearly twice the rate of other support troops. But they never complained. They crawled through minefields and crossfire, pressed bandages over wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding, and whispered words of comfort into dying ears, sometimes German, sometimes American. Private Thomas Red Miller of the 1st Infantry Division described it best. "You forget who's who when you're out there. The blood's all the same color. You just stop it from spilling." His words captured the strange equality that existed in the hands of a medic. There were no enemies, only men who needed help before time ran out. Their equipment was simple, but life-saving. A single medic's kit could hold morphas, iron, sulfur powder, gauze rolls, and plasma, each worth more than gold under fire. Many learned to improvise tourniquets from belts, stretchers from rifles, and splints from branches. In the mud and chaos, medicine became both art and instinct. To German officers, watching these unarmed Americans work in the middle of combat looked like madness. To the men they saved, it was the purest form of bravery. And soon, that bravery would reveal an even deeper truth about how far American innovation had gone in turning compassion into strategy. To the German officers captured in Normandy, what they witnessed was almost incomprehensible. The Wehrmacht was not without its own medical services. Its Sanitätsdienst was competent, often heroic, but by 1944 it was overextended, undersupplied, and hardened by years of total war. German field medics treated comrades first, enemies last, if ever. Compassion was a luxury rarely afforded on the collapsing front. But the Americans, with their organized chains of care and moral discipline, seemed to operate under a different code entirely. In one POW report preserved after the war, Oberstleutnant Gerhard Müller described the moment his perception of the enemy changed. "I was wounded outside Saint-Lô and believed I would die. An American medic came through the smoke, his face covered in mud. He gave me water and pressed my hand. When I awoke, I was in a clean bed under a tent with my wound dressed. I could not understand it. Why would he save me?" Müller wasn't alone. Countless German prisoners expressed disbelief at being treated humanely. Many had been raised on propaganda depicting the Americans as ruthless materialists, decadent and cruel. Yet here they found discipline without cruelty, efficiency without hatred. Nurses spoke softly to them. Surgeons worked on them for hours. Some even received letters sent through the Red Cross, informing their families that they were alive and recovering in Allied hands. Meanwhile, word of this treatment filtered through Wehrmacht units still fighting. Captured soldiers told their interrogators that Americans treated wounded Germans like guests, not prisoners. Even in the face of harsh realities, dwindling supplies, overflowing hospitals, the medics rarely wavered. The Geneva Convention was not merely an obligation. It was a belief system. For some Germans, this experience became a moment of moral reckoning. We had learned to obey, sit, aid one SS NCO after the war. They had learned to care. That difference defeated us more than their tanks. It was not sentimentality. It was shock at a system built on the idea that mercy itself could be a weapon. By mid-July 1944, as German officers were transported to POW hospitals across France and England, they began to see a pattern. The Americans were not simply fighting to destroy the Reich. They were fighting to prove that civilization could survive it. And that civilization was powered by something the Germans had underestimated entirely: logistics, innovation, and the relentless efficiency of American medical evacuation. Behind every act of mercy on the battlefield stood a vast and disciplined system. The United States had mastered not only how to win battles, but how to save the men who fought them. This was the hidden front of American ingenuity, the medical evacuation network, or evac chain, that stretched from the foxhole to hospitals hundreds of miles behind the lines. It was a logistical masterpiece unmatched by any other army of the war. When a soldier fell, his journey to survival began with a medic in the mud. From there, he was carried to a battalion aid station, usually a tent or barn within a mile of the fighting. There, doctors performed the first critical interventions: plasma transfusions, morphine, tourniquets, stabilization. Within hours, jeeps fitted with stretcher racks transported the wounded to a field hospital where surgical teams waited, their instruments sterilized, their hands trembling from exhaustion, but steady in purpose. The Americans were relentless in refining this process. They introduced clearing stations and collecting points, streamlining triage to avoid overcrowding. They developed mobile surgical hospitals, early precursors to the MASH units of Korea and Vietnam, that could be dismantled and moved within hours. Every detail was designed for speed. A wounded man who might have died in 1918 could now reach a surgeon in less than 2 hours. Air evacuation was perhaps the most stunning innovation. In Normandy, the US 9th Air Force used C-47 transport planes, originally designed for paratroopers, to carry the wounded back to England. Each aircraft could hold 18 stretchers and medical attendants. Within 24 hours, men who had been bleeding in the fields of France were resting in clean hospital beds in Oxfordshire or Wiltshire. For the Germans, such efficiency was unthinkable. Their medical system, though organized, had been crippled by the retreat and constant Allied bombing of supply lines. They lacked fuel, vehicles, and air transport. Many wounded simply never left the front. American efficiency became a kind of psychological weapon. It broadcast the strength of an army that valued its men so highly it refused to abandon them, even amid chaos. One German doctor later said, "The Americans did not only fight with machines, they fought with compassion, and they made it a science." That science changed warfare forever. But even the finest system could not exist without the human heart that drove it. And in the field hospitals of Normandy, that heart beat stronger than ever. Beyond the thunder of artillery and the whine of fighter planes, the field hospitals of Normandy pulsed like hidden veins of life. Set up in orchards, schoolhouses, and abandoned churches, these makeshift sanctuaries transformed chaos into order. Canvas tents rippled in the wind, generators hummed, and the sharp, sterile scent of ether mingled with the damp smell of earth. Inside, medicine met war face to face. Rows of cots stretched across the floor, each bearing a motionless shape, some in olive drab, others in field grey. Nurses, sleeves rolled high, moved with quiet precision between them, changing dressings, adjusting plasma lines, whispering encouragement. The rhythmic hiss of oxygen tanks filled the air. Outside, truck engines idled, ready to take the stable patients to evacuation hospitals farther inland. The surgeons were relentless. They operated for 16, sometimes 20 hours without rest. Sweat mixed with blood on their forearms as they worked under harsh light. Each operation was a race against time. Remove the shrapnel, stop the bleeding, keep the pulse. The supply officers made sure nothing ran out. Sutures, sulfur, morphine, sterilized instruments, all replenished by a logistical chain that stretched back to England. It was this machine-like coordination that turned compassion into survival statistics. German prisoners who ended up on those operating tables were often stunned into silence. Some couldn't believe they were being treated at all, let alone with the same care as American soldiers. A nurse from the 45th Evacuation Hospital recalled a moment when a wounded German teenager reached for her hand and whispered, "Why?" She simply replied, "Because you're hurt." That was the essence of it, simple humanity amid destruction. The staff rarely saw the front, but they felt it in every stretcher that arrived. They knew that for each man they saved, others were dying only miles away. Yet within those tents, war's brutality paused, just long enough for life to win a few battles of its own. One surgeon, Colonel Walter Benedict, later said, "It was like trying to hold back the ocean with a cup, but every drop mattered." His words echoed the philosophy that kept these hospitals running long after exhaustion had claimed the rest of the army. And then, in one remarkable moment, even the boundaries between enemies dissolved completely, when a truce was called not for surrender, but for mercy. In mid-July 1944, near a shattered crossroads outside Saint-Lô, a rare and almost impossible moment unfolded. Both German and American units, battered by days of fighting, found themselves with wounded stranded in no man's land. The ground was a wasteland, shell craters, burning vehicles, the smell of cordite and death heavy in the air. For hours, neither side dared move. The wounded cried out in English and German alike. Then, somewhere between the lines, a white cloth appeared on a rifle barrel. An informal ceasefire began, not through command orders, but through compassion. American medics stepped out first, cautious but determined, their Red Cross armbands visible even through the grime. Moments later, German stretcher bearers emerged from the smoke, their helmets marked with the same symbol. No one spoke. The two groups met silently, exchanging quick nods, each man aware that the slightest movement could reignite hell. Together, they carried bodies, some alive, some gone, back toward the ditches and aid posts. An American medic knelt beside a wounded German who had been lying for 12 hours with a broken femur. He worked beside a Wehrmacht doctor, both using what little supplies they had to stabilize the man. For a few fleeting hours, the war paused, replaced by the quiet rhythm of care. Those who witnessed it never forgot. One US corporal wrote in his diary, "We didn't think, we just helped. For once it felt like the world made sense again." German accounts echoed the same astonishment. "They did not curse us or boast," remembered Feldwebel Karl Lenz. "They worked until the wounded were safe, then vanished back into the smoke." When the guns roared again that evening, the truce dissolved as quickly as it had begun. But something had changed in those who took part. Both sides returned to their lines carrying not just stretchers, but a memory that cut through the Piłsudczyki. Propaganda and hatred, a moment when enemies became men again. Later, captured officers spoke of it with quiet reverence. They had been trained to see Americans as mechanical, emotionless warriors. What they found instead was something far more dangerous to their beliefs, an enemy capable of mercy. And in the days that followed, that perception would deepen as German prisoners experienced the full system of American care from within its tents and wards. For the German officers and soldiers captured after Normandy, being wounded was no longer a death sentence. It became a lesson in disbelief. Transported from the field hospitals of France to medical facilities in England, and later to prisoner of war camps across the United States, they entered a world utterly foreign to their expectations. The Americans not only fed and clothed them, they healed them. And that, to many hardened men of the Wehrmacht, was the deepest shock of all. At Camp Clinton in Mississippi and Fort Devens in Massachusetts, German POW hospitals ran with the same discipline and efficiency as any US Army installation. The wards were bright, sterilized, lined with neat beds, each man given sheets, bandages, and medication. American doctors oversaw their recovery, while German medical personnel, also captured, were permitted to assist. It was not propaganda, it was policy, enforced by the Geneva Convention and the moral tone set by American command. Interrogation reports captured the astonishment in their words. "I expected humiliation," said one Luftwaffe pilot after being treated for burns in a hospital in Oxfordshire. "Instead, the doctor told me, 'You're safe now. We fix you first, then we talk.' It was the first time since the war began that I felt like a human again." German officers, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front, compared the experience with the Soviet treatment of prisoners and were shaken by the contrast. For the first time, they understood that America's power was not just industrial, it was moral and psychological. Its soldiers could crush cities, yet spare the wounded without hesitation. This paradox haunted many of them. "We thought mercy was weakness," one captured major admitted, "but on that day, we saw it was strength." Reports sent back through Red Cross channels spread through the Wehrmacht ranks like rumor and revelation. Some refused to believe it. Others held on to it as proof that not all enemies were monsters. The Americans didn't preach their morality, they practiced it, and it eroded years of propaganda in a single encounter. As the war dragged on and the Reich began to crumble, those memories of care, of clean beds, fair treatment, and American medics kneeling beside dying Germans remained etched into the minds of men who had once called them enemies. But compassion always carried a cost. For the medics themselves, that cost was measured not in medals, but in blood. Behind every saved life lay a medic's gamble with death. The Red Cross on a helmet was supposed to grant protection, but on the battlefields of Europe, it often made them targets. In Normandy alone, hundreds of American medics were killed or wounded while dragging men from open ground. They fought an invisible war, one where the enemy wasn't just the opposing army, but time itself. Every heartbeat lost could mean a life slipping away. Private Joseph Lapointe of the 101st Airborne wrote in his field diary, "You can't think about bullets when someone's screaming your name." He was 21 when he ran into fire to treat a wounded comrade. A sniper's round cut him down before he reached the man. His aid bag was found beside 2 empty morphine syrettes. Countless stories like his became quiet legends among the infantry, tales of men who carried no rifles, but whose bravery outshone everyone around them. The casualty rate among American medics remained brutally high throughout the war. Many units lost nearly half their medical personnel during prolonged engagements, yet replacements always volunteered. The reputation of the medic carried a strange, almost sacred weight. Soldiers would risk their own lives to protect them, yelling, "Medic up!" as if calling for salvation itself. Even hardened veterans grew emotional when speaking of the men who patched them together in the mud. Awards followed, but most medics never lived to wear them. The Medal of Honor was given to men like Technician 5th Grade Desmond Doss, who, though serving in the Pacific, symbolized what every medic in Europe stood for. Unarmed, he saved 75 lives on Okinawa's cliffs. His courage embodied the same selflessness seen across Normandy, the Ardennes, and Italy. Those who survived carried invisible wounds. Many medics spoke later of the haunting silence that followed the battles, the moment when they realized how many they couldn't save. A few returned home unable to sleep without the sound of engines or the smell of antiseptic nearby. But despite the pain, they held no bitterness. They had lived by a code older than warfare itself, to protect life where others destroyed it. And as the Allies pushed deeper into occupied Europe, that same compassion expanded far beyond soldiers, to the civilians, prisoners, and survivors who would soon fill their hospitals in staggering numbers. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing. The German front lines were folding inward, cities lay in ruin, and the Allies were advancing through a landscape of suffering that words could barely contain. For the American Medical Corps, victory did not mean rest. It meant more work, because the full measure of war's destruction was only beginning to reveal itself. When Allied units liberated camps like Dachau and Buchenwald, medics were among the first inside. What they found stunned even the most hardened veterans. Emaciated prisoners, skeletal children, men and women barely clinging to life. Many were too weak to speak. The medics had treated battle wounds before, but this was different. These were wounds of starvation, neglect, and cruelty. They worked around the clock, setting up makeshift hospitals inside the camps, boiling water in metal drums, cutting uniforms into bandages, and using every scrap of medical supply they could find. In some places, German doctors, captured or surrendering, were ordered to assist under American supervision. Lieutenant Robert Abzug of the 45th Infantry recalled, "We'd just come from the front, covered in dirt and blood, but when we walked into those camps, the war changed meaning. It wasn't about victory anymore. It was about restoring something human." Meanwhile, in towns across France and Germany, American medics were treating civilians by the thousands. Refugees, bomb victims, orphaned children, all passed through the tents once meant for soldiers. Field hospitals became centers of healing for entire regions. The Red Cross worked hand in hand with the army to distribute food, medicine, and blankets. The same men who had crawled through gunfire now cradled infants, stitched civilian wounds, and handed out soup to the hungry. German prisoners continued to receive medical care as well, a fact that continued to astonish captured Red officers. Some even volunteered to help rebuild local clinics. The war was ending, but the American principle of compassion had not wavered. In those final months, the medics represented something larger than any military triumph. They were the first face of mercy that Europe saw after years of terror. And as the guns fell silent, their quiet work became a bridge between conqueror and conquered, a reminder that healing was also a form of victory. That bridge would not only rebuild lives, it would reshape the entire philosophy of modern warfare. When the guns of Europe finally fell silent in May 1945, the U.S. Army Medical Department had recorded a transformation as profound as any battlefield victory. It had saved millions through systems so effective they would become the blueprint for every major military and humanitarian operation that followed. In the wreckage of war, a new science had been born, one built on speed, mobility, and compassion. The innovations forged in the mud of Normandy became the foundation of modern emergency medicine. The tiered evacuation chain, the golden hour principle, would influence civilian trauma care for decades. Techniques for triage, plasma transfusion, and portable surgery would later be refined in Korea, perfected in Vietnam, and taught in hospitals around the world. By 1945, a wounded soldier under American care had a 96% chance of survival if he reached a medical station alive. In 1918, that number had been closer to 60. Air evacuation, once an experiment, became doctrine. The C-47 flying ambulance evolved into the helicopter medevac system that defined later conflicts. The field hospitals, mobile surgical units, and logistical precision pioneered by the Americans reshaped how nations viewed the wounded, not as burdens, but as lives worth any cost to save. Even the Geneva Convention itself would be rewritten in 1949, strengthened by the lessons the US had proved possible. But perhaps the most enduring legacy wasn't medical. It was moral. German officers and POWs who survived under American care carried home a memory that defied everything they had been taught. Many later admitted that their perception of the enemy changed forever after experiencing American medical treatment. The simple act of a medic kneeling beside a fallen German did more to dismantle hatred than propaganda ever could. The same philosophy would guide future American missions. disaster relief, peacekeeping, humanitarian aid, where medics and doctors became ambassadors of compassion long after the war ended. The United States had shown the world that power could be measured not only in bombs and tanks, but in the lives one chose to save. And yet, amid all that progress, one truth remained. The greatest weapon America had unveiled in World War II wasn't a machine or a strategy. It was mercy itself. That mercy, carried through generations of medics and doctors, would come to symbolize something far greater than victory. It would define what it meant to be human after surviving the darkest century. When the war finally ended, silence returned to the fields of France. The hedgerows that once hid medics and wounded men grew over with wildflowers. The sound of engines and artillery faded, replaced by the slow rhythm of rebuilding. Yet for those who had lived through it, that silence was never complete. It carried echoes, of voices calling for help, of stretchers creaking in the mud, of whispered prayers under smoky skies. Those echoes belonged to the medics, the quiet figures who had fought a different kind of war. They had no medals for heroism in the traditional sense. Their courage was not the kind shouted in parades or written in headlines. It lived in moments unseen, kneeling beside dying strangers, giving water to prisoners, holding a hand until the pulse stopped. They were men and women who chose humanity over hatred, even when surrounded by destruction. For many German officers who survived, those moments redefined their understanding of the enemy. Years later, memoirs and interviews from former Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe personnel spoke of astonishment, not at American firepower, but at American mercy. "They treated our wounded before their own," wrote one veteran of the 352nd Infantry Division. "It was then I realized they were not like the monsters our propaganda described. They were men of conscience." Historians now view the U.S. Army Medical Corps of World War II as one of the quiet revolutions of modern warfare. Its blend of science, logistics, and compassion proved that even in total war, humanity could endure. It set a precedent that the strength of a nation was not only measured in the battles it won, but in the lives it chose to save along the way. The medics themselves rarely spoke of heroism, they simply called it duty. But for every German who awoke in an American hospital bed, for every prisoner who survived because an enemy refused to let him die, the meaning of victory changed forever. In the end, the image that remains is not one of conquest, but of a single act. An American medic kneeling in the mud, tending the wounds of a man who had tried to kill him. That moment, more than any battle, revealed the truth of the American spirit. Mercy amid fire, humanity in the heart of war.